In our previous meetings, we established that what we call esoteric psychology is, first and foremost, an inquiry, a dynamic, rather than a static body of knowledge. This marks a fundamental departure from what we generally understand as psychology. Here, a theory is not truly possible. That would be a contradiction in terms. It may only be presented as a theory in the sense of an attractor, a magnet acting as an object of desire, so that the psyche, in its habitual state, might become interested in other dimensions of the psychic realm. In this light, esoteric psychology is both a discovery and simultaneously a flowering of qualities within the observing organism. It is a discovery of new dimensions within the human being who, in the very act of discovery, experiences their blossoming. That is precisely why they can be discovered. To put it another way, the essential core of these gatherings is this very articulation. As a primary distinction, we can say there exists a universe of vibrations to which we react, and these reactions are converted into behaviors. These vibrations, in turn, are interpreted. The dynamics of interpreting vibration are linked to the possibility of different reactions toward that vibration. First, what we might call blind reactions occur, then more conscious reactions, and finally what we call responses. That is, non-mechanical reactions that arise from a complex learning process in the registry of vibration. Let us add a layer of complexity. In reality, every reaction is an interpretation, and every interpretation is a reaction. Every meaning is a cerebral reaction. Moving toward a piece of bread because of hunger is an interpretation by the organism, a decoding of the metabolic circulation. We divide reaction from interpretation when in fact they are the same. We generally split them into two planes, referring to reactions as something blind and interpretations as something more reflective or cognitive. However, at the heart of our reflection is the fact that our interpretations are reactions. They are triggered by vibration. They are spontaneous responses of the brain and its conditioning, causing it to decode vibration in a certain way, according to the state of integration of the system. The inquiry proper to esoteric psychology lies precisely in the progressive understanding of this process. This allows us to inhibit or delay spontaneous reactions and interpretations, so that other levels of response and decoding can be enabled, allowing for fuller, less fragmentary responses to the vibration. Question: and would that cease to be a reaction? Carutti: we might call it a response instead of a reaction, where the distinction is drawn between the fragmentary and the holistic. Question: it would be like proposing a context in which interpretation is no longer seen as a reaction. Carutti: for the vehicle, this implies first making transparent the fact that every interpretation is a reaction. By making transparent, I mean accepting that there is a dynamics of vibration that produces a response and discovering that these responses are mechanical. Question: is interpretation inevitable? Carutti: the vehicle interprets. Life interprets. An amoeba interprets. We could even say that hydrogen interprets that there is an oxygen valence available to form water. Interpretation is an articulation of information. In some cases, it is absolutely mechanical and circumscribed, but there is always interpretation. It is a type of response, a type of reaction that provides meaning, placing the stimulus within an order based on an underlying code. We can differentiate between conditioned interpretations, which are mechanical, and transparent interpretations. I use the word transparent in the sense that reactions interpretations are inevitable. The brain's reaction to vibration cannot be avoided, but it can be rendered unimportant. The vehicle's reaction to vibration cannot be avoided, but it can be delayed by other levels and consequently inhibited, which is not the same as being suppressed. It is inhibited because a broader, more global response emerges, manifesting a level of processing that retards the mechanical or immediate reaction. It is capable of introducing a flow of information infinitely richer into the decoding and the response. Question: and can that inhibition be voluntary? Carutti: that inhibition can only be the result of a high integration of the system, a new integration that transcends the stage of the will. The fact that it is not voluntary is central. As long as it remains voluntary, it implies a control of the reaction, indicating the primacy of control as an intermediate stage of that dynamic. If we wish to view this with greater precision, we should say that we are dealing with three different levels of vibration: vibration, interpretation, and reaction. All are different levels of vibration. The physical brain is a level of vibration. Thought is a level of vibration. Subtler vibrations are another level still. What we are investigating is this magical dance of vibrations across different planes, which, as we have said, is ultimately the weaving of 7 vibrations across multiple planes of reality. In the final analysis, esoteric psychology dissolves into a vibratory learning process. When I say it dissolves, I mean that all its concepts and forms refer back to a vibratory learning, first defined as a human learning about the vibratory, and later as the dynamics of the learning of the vibrations themselves in their creative process. Esoteric psychology is, precisely, the accounting of this dynamic, this progression. It is an inquiry that tracks this progression, which becomes possible as new levels of integration flourish, allowing for a new articulation of these vibrations. What esoteric psychology investigates and what allows it to investigate are one and the same. That is to say, the investigator is the investigated. There is no one standing outside the research. When the level of interpretation is centered on the self, it tends to interpret this dynamic as the attainment of achievements, powers, or strange magical attributes for the individual. The self will interpret it that way, when in reality it is the flowering of new levels of integration that are essentially spontaneous and creative, manifesting only from a level of development that lies beyond the dynamics of the self. Question: can this flowering be encouraged? Carutti: that is the most complex articulation of all. Let us leave that question in suspense. The progression of the objects of desire. In our previous meeting, we spoke of the presence of these three currents: the current of vitality, the current of thought, and that very difficult current to define and comprehend, which we call the astral currents. Vitality, astral, thought. Think of a Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon clan. There, a certain etheric current is present, the specific vitality of that land. The vital currents of the jungle, the ocean, the desert, or the ice are not the same. There, certain astral currents and certain currents of thought exist. I use the term currents of thought to emphasize something that is not intuitive. That thought is a spontaneous, mechanical activity that occurs automatically in the members of a clan. We usually say everyone thinks for themselves, but if one observes closely, they will find this is not true. There is a certain activity, an interactive dynamic, that triggers thoughts, questions, and answers, which are fitted within that collective articulation. They depend profoundly on the language that spontaneously emerged in that tribe. Language allows the world to be symbolized in one way and not another. It determines thought, and collective interaction makes us think, even though we believe we think for ourselves. What we call thought could be termed, at least at this stage, thought currents. Let us define this particular web as something very primitive. At the intersection of these currents, in the dawn of humanity, vitality and the astral predominate, while thought is fluctuating and low, lacking potency. However, the natural drift of the process over millennia leads toward the development of thought as a potent element capable of fixing its representations. This progressively forms a center that defines itself as personal and exclusive, separated from other centers, entities, and the rest of the universe. The articulation between these three currents leads over millennia to the predominance of thought, and it is thought that creates the sensation that I am the one thinking. The community, through its dialogue, reinforces this sensation, giving us the certainty that there exists within each of us that particular fixed center, the nucleus of all sensations and experiences that we currently call a person. As we have seen through successive human experiences, the changing articulation of these currents creates successive objects of desire. We said that through evolution, the human being constructs successive objects of desire, internal representations that promise sensations, and because of this, we seek to configure external reality according to the internal one. Forgive me for putting it in difficult terms, but if I say it as we usually do, the process remains hidden. We can say that, from a certain moment, these constructions tend fundamentally toward the control of reactions provoked by an excess of vitality, and also toward a progressive control of the excessive permeability to astral currents. Both are gradually dominated by a thought that is increasingly potent and organized. In this dynamic, what we call the desire body of humanity is formed. It is everything we desire as humans, everything we have first imagined mentally and finally materialized. These objects of desire are mental creations, but they possess the power to make us act. The different levels of integration of vitality, astrality, and thought, unique to each individual, community, and era, cause us to change our objects of desire and react to them differently. Some will respond to subtler objects. Supposedly, we no longer respond to gross objects of desire, such as eating the heart of an enemy, which was once a fundamental object of desire. First eating the totem, later the flesh and blood of a god. I say this to indicate that objects of desire progress according to certain fundamental structures. This is what we have called the torrent, a dynamic with an internal logic in which a myriad of objects of desire constantly circulate. In principle, we say that eating God is subtler than eating the heart of the enemy. When we say subtle, we mean it provokes different sensations and feelings. It circulates a different charge within us that replaces the previous coarser charges. That is, the organism's set of responses is progressively domesticated. Eating the benevolent God activates certain types of feelings that are broader and more integrative than those activated by eating the enemy's heart, which represents intense but repellent feelings, in the sense that they are produced at the expense of another human being. In the act of eating God, that object of desire transfers a charge and utilizes the feelings and sensations that previously dominated me. Through these, the system learns to react differently to the other. Implicit in the act of eating the benevolent God is the progressive development of the feeling of acceptance of the different. Now, in this evolution of the dynamics of desire, there is also the construction and development of this personal center. This is the one who desires, who feels that they desire, and who tries to satisfy those desires, which, as we know, can be physical, emotional, mental, the desire to know, or spiritual, the desire to be saved, to escape the wheel of reincarnation, or to be chosen as someone special by the benevolent God. In spiritual desires, as much as in any other, the longing to possess, to have, or to appropriate arises. The center yearns to have or reach that which it has configured as a spiritual object of desire. Personality, the center and its activities. Carutti. In this context, the fundamental dynamics of the torrent converge into a potent vortex, the personality. Beyond any rationalizations, this personality feels separate from the rest of the universe. It possesses a greater or lesser veracity, an ability to appropriate those objects it has defined as desirable, whether they be physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual. Let us observe that the dynamics of the torrent, which leads sooner or later to the development of this voracious center, tear the very fabric of life. It does this by organizing life into separate objects that must be pursued and possessed. The intensely desiring center organizes itself as a fragment that yearns to take objects. That is, to cut out a piece of life and claim it as its own. This can even occur within a spiritual experience. The progressive shift of objects may reach a level of great subtlety. However, when someone registers a high vibrational experience, for example, what do they tend to do? Do they let the spiritual experience pass like a cloud before them? Or do they appropriate it, treasure it, remember it, and dwell upon it? Do they write books, tell others of their experience, and transform it into something exceptional? Through this, do they teach, gain prestige, feel secure and special, and live through that experience? In such a case, will they eventually have another, perhaps more complex and richer experience? The more one lives based on a previous experience, the less likely they are to have richer ones. They will only have repetitions of the past or constructions based upon it to which they grant reality. They will satisfy that desire through imagination and repetition, but they will lose, more or less rapidly, the vibratory state that allowed for the initial experience, the very state in which that experience originated. In that moment, the state of integration that allowed for an opening and contact was converted into an experience. an experience the center appropriated. The center lived it as its own experience rather than as a new state of being. Therefore, it carves it out, appropriates it, and organizes all subsequent behavior around that object. Question? Inaudible. Carutti. I would say there is an inertia here, a collective inertia we do not see, like the air we breathe or the water in which fish swim. This collective inertia tells us that to develop thought, we must inhibit vitality. For if vitality is too potent, it sweeps us toward a different kind of behavior. This collective inertia leads us to displace our objects of desire, a process known as sublimation. Sublimation at an evolutionary level. To develop complex levels of thought, one must inhibit vitality in the astral level, thereby losing sensory depth and sensitivity. Only much later in the process can something comprehend this dynamic and return. But initially on the outward journey of this process, the levels of vitality and astrality are inhibited, or relatively so. Nevertheless, the dynamics of desire remain the same. The energy that charges the object, in this case a spiritual one, arises from a center yearning for satisfaction. At this level of development, the dynamics that generate the center are not yet understood, nor is the need to coordinate these levels, which in their inertia tend to create that very center. Esoteric psychology on one level is fundamentally interested in understanding the creation and activities of the center. When we fail to perceive this, we believe this dynamic is the only one possible, just as these activities seem infinite and vastly different from one another. Yet in the final analysis, it is always the same, the infinite transformations of a single matrix. Question: this center is what we call the ego, the yo. Carutti: yes, but I am using the word center intentionally because it is even more complex than the ego. It encompasses all dimensions of this activity. It is the need to centralize the decoding and interpretation of different registers, to appropriate sensations, centralize their decoding, and refer them back to a core. Question: it is an axis that aligns the other levels. Carutti: it is an axis and it emerges as an evolutionary necessity. It is inherent in the dynamics of the process itself. Now, esoteric psychology is primarily interested in understanding this dynamic and its successive articulations within the collective and for each human organism. For instance, how an individual might live an existence where they experience powerful feelings based on a few theological ideas and a very controlled vitality. In this case, thought is relatively poor and fixed, and vitality is highly regulated. Yet these ideas generate objects and forms that empower the subtler astral levels we call feelings. As we mentioned last time, these constitute the experience of love through an other, not love as a vibratory state, but as a feeling induced by external objects. Question: inaudible. Carutti: the love that comes through an other, whether that other is a spiritual object or another human being, is a lesson in the dilation of the astral vehicle. It allows us to elevate it to a level of vibration we call feeling, becoming increasingly subtle and sublime. In that sense, it is an evolutionary step, a vital step within this dynamic. The refinement of the astral through the feelings generated by a beloved creates a certain state. However, it is not a state of true openness because it remains part of the torrent insofar as it is appropriated by the ego. That love is claimed. The love for another human or the love for that God is appropriated by the center, generating astral sensations. They may be subtle, beautiful, and wonderful, but they are astral, meaning they are dependent on an object and possess an opposite. Every astral vibration has an opposite. The Buddhic vibration does not. I suggest you think of this as a phenomenon of induction. If one looks globally and evolutionarily, the human organism continually generates inductors, triggers for broader responses. We do not currently view these inductors, objects, people, ideas, as such, because we identify with them. We are even willing to die for them. We cannot yet understand them as part of a necessary mechanism that allows us to open new dimensions or progressively refine coarser processes. This is why I say that esoteric psychology, from one perspective, is an in-depth investigation into the nature of the torrent and the construction of the center. General scientific psychology is an investigation into what is necessary to form a center and ensure it functions healthily. Here we find a very important distinction. This is the ceiling of scientific psychology, its basic dynamic. Esoteric psychology as a field of knowledge is interested in the states following the center. Beyond the center, regarding published works, we can conceive of them as certain types of texts intended to attract the interest of the ego, so that the object of desire shifts toward that which lies beyond the ego. In organized religion, God is interested in what lies beyond the ego, but without an investigation into the ego. In what I call esoteric psychology, all states subsequent to the God concept are the focus of interest. This causes the ego to begin absorbing and representing an organization in which states exist beyond itself, where the ego is seen as merely one stage among many. The path of return. Now, what we call the torrent, which is, in a way, the sum of human experiences, responds to a matrix of manifestation. Like all manifestation, if we view it from the plane of the abstract mind, it follows a certain pattern. This torrent is governed by a pattern, and that pattern is what we referred to in esoteric astrology classes as the fundamental pattern. If we look at the zodiac, we see how, from a certain point, every process develops a center. After that, it is pulled in a direction that first transforms it and then dissolves it, reabsorbing it, like all other forms, into the vibratory continuum. Thus, we see that the torrent contains a double dynamic. On one hand, the torrent is fed by our yearning for experience, following a logic of seeking and repeating experiences across different levels, from the coarsest to the most subtle. But within this logic, another, deeper one opens. The yearning to understand those experiences, and the yearning to understand the nature of experiencing itself. There, the dynamic shifts. First, I want to experience and experience, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Here, the ego grows, integrates, and develops powerfully. However, the dynamics of the torrent carry an inevitable residue. Being fragmentary, they bring conflict, pain, and illusion. The outward journey is saturated with pain and illusion. The very logic of this process eventually gives rise to a new object of desire, a new longing, the longing to understand that initial yearning, to understand the why of that veracity, why we wish to experience insatiably the why of desire itself. This turn is the beginning of what is called the path of return. To traverse this path of return, the system must possess a high level of vital, astral, and mental integration. It is as if the entity had already undergone what Hindu tradition calls the organizing disciplines that lead to peak performance. First, the circulation of energy in the vehicle. Second, devotion, the feeling toward a divinized other. And third, the capacity of thought to operate in multiple dimensions, allowing for the flowering of the abstract mind. Yet even here, we are still within the ego. At a certain level of this development, the yearning to understand the process itself begins to predominate. The system begins to realize it is being swept along in the chain of existence. There, the center, the state of consciousness we call the ego, begins to perceive a more essential dynamic. It perceives the existence of a deeper center that points toward the integration of all possible experiences. This is not just the integration of the different vehicles we have seen thus far, but the integration of all experiences, the synthesis of all human experience. This new center attracts consciousness, which begins to expand toward the realization, nothing human is alien to me. Consciousness begins to register what will later be configured as an archetype of synthesis, the synthesis of all possible human experiences. On one level, then, we find all experiences in a state of fragmentation in their chaotic and fragmentary succession. On another level are the successive syntheses of human experience in the very matrix of all human experience. The superficial center begins to be pulled toward this deeper synthetic center. Question, inaudible. Carutti, this is not an intellectual process. It is a dynamic that surfaces through contact with a level that exists in a different dimension than the superficial ego. It is not found within a linear dimension of experience. This will appear to consciousness in various ways, with different representations, depending on the level of contact with this deep center and the conditioning of the superficial ego. Initially, this center will appear as a divine and external center, but progressively it will be perceived as an internal other, as another internal center, the inner divinity, in greater or lesser conflict with the superficial center. We might represent this as a faint and progressive perception that the center we call the personality or ego floats in a transpersonal ocean. In the depths of this transpersonal ocean exists a synthetic center of all possible experiences for which the ego hungers. On one level, this synthetic center of all experiences will be registered as containing the various forms of experience, like a kaleidoscope. On another, deeper level, it will be registered as containing the charge, the vibration inherent in those experiences. The forms are images of all possible experiences in which consciousness is caught like a spider's web. In the other case, it is the vibration itself of what has been lived and experienced by humanity, independent of the specific forms in which it was felt. It is pure vibratory content that can take hundreds or thousands of possible forms. Think of the difference between a war movie from 10 years ago and the opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan. In older war films, one sees various images of war, more or less realistic. But the vibratory response to those scenes is still very remote. One sees but feels little. However, watching the Normandy landing in Saving Private Ryan, one receives the total impact of war, from bravery to horror, within the vibratory content of the situation. This level of the charge of experiences, which deepens the image by universalizing it, is a second level. Here one finds the distillate of all possible experiences independent of their form or anecdote, all loves and all horrors, the distillate of beauty, fear, greed, bravery, and so on. I use the example of cinema because I believe it is the best way to see it. It is one thing to see all the films that contain the vision of both the horrors and the beauty of war, its senselessness and its tragic necessity. It is quite another to witness films where one feels what the protagonists have lived in all its ambivalence. We can say that this deep center contains and radiates both the images of all possible experiences and the quality of this more essential level, where the brain can register the influx of the charges of all experience. What we call the personality begins to unconsciously register this presence. In this regard, Jung is vital, for he shows the early stages of this contact with what he calls the self, a deep organizer of the inevitably unbalanced experience of the personality. The personality, the ego, has a necessarily fragmentary activity. At a certain psychological stage, the unconscious emits images or powerful experiences of the presence of a deeper center that seeks to balance the excessive fragmentation of the more superficial levels, the matrix of the human. Question: but does it remain fragmentary? Carutti: it is not fragmentary from the perspective of the torrent. On that level, it embodies the synthesis of the torrent itself, the synthesis of all that is humanly possible. This is the matrix of the human. For this reason, mere contact with this nucleus immediately acts as an ordering principle for the deviations of the personality. When this new circulation begins to activate, the personality organizes itself in a more positive, less fragmentary manner. Consequently, its objects of desire begin to shift. In esoteric terms, these appearances of the deep center speak to us of the path of return. The voice of this center emerges in various ways whenever the imbalance is great, manifesting according to the different stages of integration. When I say voice, I refer to dreams, images, and sounds, the means by which, according to their conditioning, the more superficial levels decode the profound pulse of vital experience. Starting from a certain level of integration, two archetypes begin to articulate in the depths: the archetype of fragmentation, the craving for existence in its voracious appetite for fragments, and the archetype that expresses the yearning for synthesis, which is taking shape internally. We can think of the latter as a higher octave of the moral conscience. Much earlier in the process, moral conscience manifested, and even before that, the conflict between external gods who embodied the basic good-evil duality according to social conditioning. At a certain point, however, this appears as a defined internal experience where the craving for fragmentary experience stands in stark contrast to the yearning for synthesis. What is relevant here is that the personality becomes increasingly interested in the way its particular experiences resonate within the universal. Because this center is universal, personal life begins to articulate itself more and more within a universal resonance. At a certain stage, this awakens a definite sensitivity toward how one's own personal experience echoes in the universal. In another octave of the process, this is experienced in reverse, seeing how that which is called personal is actually a manifestation of the universal. That is, the personal center, in the very act of living, experiences the universal that qualifies it. This convergence between the particular and the universal, divisions created by thought, is decisive in the process. The development of internal qualities that allow us to register first how the particular resonates in the universal, and then how the particular is a manifestation of the universal, is an essential part of the flowering. Thus, the personality begins to appear as the kaleidoscopic creation of this deep level of humanity, as an emergent property, an effect, or a construction born from the heart of humanity. Consequently, the experiences of the personality will be felt as effects rather than causes. Throughout this dynamic, the impulses to understand and synthesize experiences are accentuated, as is the realization of the need to exhaust experiences. Something within the entity understands the fatality of the mechanical tendency toward experimentation and veracity. It understands that if this is not exhausted, the movement will be infinite. Simultaneously, and this depends on many factors, the organism becomes increasingly receptive to the presence of creative vibrations that lie beyond the complex dynamics of desire fulfillment. The central theme is that the yearning for experience begins to understand itself. In the heart of humanity lies this yearning for experience that leads us toward fragmentation, and this is understood here as a movement that is not merely personal. It is the heart of humanity itself that begins to comprehend human veracity, not as a personal greed, but as a deep conditioning. It understands the relationship between veracity and its consequences. It grasps all the times we have been swept away by that veracity and the fallout thereof on both the densest and subtlest levels. It also understands the attempts to control this through the will and the consequences of those attempts. Question: does this exhaustion of experiences relate to the transition from the mutable cross to the fixed cross? Carutti: yes, here we are, decidedly within the fixed cross. Several juxtaposed dynamics are at play here. Of course, within this nucleus, one finds experiences of both infinite pain and sublime love. But at this level, they are framed by the logic of the path of return, in the profound sense of understanding human suffering, rather than merely dealing with the consequences of one's acts. It is the understanding of desire, of death. Everything is there, pulsing to be understood. An archetype of this center exists, presenting itself in three levels: the level of images and knowledge of all possible experiences, as if we were walking through the museum of humanity. This is the synthesis of human knowledge, the level containing the charges of all possible experiences and the wisdom that allows for a new relationship with experience, the progressive synthesis of that charge. There, the organism spontaneously connects pleasure with pain and veracity with illusion. It does not act out veracity first, and then after many experiences, I realize the illusion. Seen from the personality, the deep dynamic of this center is the shortening of time. It shortens the time of experiences because it synthesizes them. The personality will register this as the interval between veracity and illusion becoming much shorter, eventually immediate. Between fear and control, the interval becomes shorter, eventually immediate. That is, the intervals between cause and consequence are shortened. Time is reabsorbed as the deep center informs the personality. The level of renunciation of experience, the definitive letting go of the yearning for experience, this is not an act of will that belonged much earlier to the stage of religious experience. This is a matter of letting a whole series of experiences fall away, leaving an available void, the vibration of death. Question: But one cannot let go of everything, for that would be death itself. Carutti. That is precisely why I call it renunciation. This clearly involves death and the definite entry of the vibration of death into one's own existence. There is nothing sinister about this, nor is it connected to a longing to cease living. Rather, it empties the superficial meaning of existence. When I say superficial, I am referring to levels we habitually consider very deep and significant. This emptying makes way for the beginning of true creative work. Question: but it is not death, it is a different state. Carutti. It is important, however, that we use the word death, because from the other side, this is perceived as death. It does not mean there are no more experiences, but rather that there is no longer a longing to sustain the experience as such. The key is to understand the longing for experience, not the act of living. Death is the death of the craving for experience. There is no longer an experiencer, there is only the event. Question: it would be a state of pure presence. Carutti. Although being overly analytical is often a mistake, I will be so to illustrate a point. This is still within time. I assume you have felt this. After having a series of experiences where you already know how they will end, you reach a point where you simply let go. Generally, this allows life to lead us naturally or bring us toward more integrated experiences. Now, there is a dynamic where this becomes increasingly deep, global, and universal. I can realize this through my personal experience and let go simply because otherwise I end up badly. But here, we are in a much more profound dynamic, understanding something fundamental about the human condition, that within this human dynamic, I and everyone else end up badly. We end in pain, in illusion, in the loss of energy. Realizing this brings with it a new type of energy and creativity. Question: and this relates to Neptune. Carutti. From one perspective, this relates to Neptune, but to a higher Neptune, one endowed with a capacity for resonance and significance that allows for the reuniting or relinking of the universal and the personal. Question: it also sounds like the 12th house. Carutti. In a way, yes, but here it is about living the 4th house as the 12th house, not just the 12th house as itself. To bring this to a more concrete plane, so it does not merely become another object of desire for us, let us think of a writer. A writer has a great capacity for mental coordination. They love words, they love the mind, and they love composing with language to evoke images, feelings, sensations, and lived experiences. Through the mental, they capture the emotional. Even the playwright knows how to articulate vehicles to produce a bodily reaction. They know how to weave words, vehicles, and plots to provoke a profound resonance in the spectator. Consider Shakespeare, for example. Within the torrent, an immense wisdom appears in him regarding a vast array of human experiences, particularly those tied to the center. The king as an archetype. Something in him possesses this capacity to coordinate words, gestures, and evocative physical postures. This allows him to give form to a series of personal experiences that thus become universal. He grants us access to the universality of human experience at a specific level. In doing this, he demonstrates a highly elevated capacity for articulation, but he also shows us a synthesis, an understanding of the longing and veracity that lead to countless experiences. In fact, we could say he is detaching himself from that longing by being able to objectify it. He is purifying himself because he objectifies his understanding of the chain of causes and consequences within the tapestry of human experience. We could say there is something in him that responds to this deeper center, something capable of coordinating and giving form, and through that, letting go. At this level of concreteness, I do not believe Shakespeare actually wanted to be a king. Reading his dramas, sensing his wisdom regarding monarchs, one can smell, as if in a perfume, that the last thing Shakespeare wanted was to be a king. He understood the experience of the king profoundly, inside and out. From his perspective, Shakespeare is living experiences much richer than that of a king. He is living all kings and the total understanding of the kingly experience. By understanding all kings, I detach from the longing to be one. And this detachment allows generations upon generations of human spectators actors and directors to recreate some level of this deep understanding of the king's longing, of the saturation of that desire. Perhaps the spectators identify with the king, but if they truly see the depth of Shakespeare's work, they may eventually renounce that identification. Taken as a whole, it is all written as a renunciation of the king. The actor reciting Shakespeare, who simultaneously lives the glory of their own ego on stage, exists in a double bind. Vibrationally, even more than the spectator, they live Macbeth, King Lear, Henry V, or Richard II. They pulse with that reality while simultaneously pulsing with their own desire to be the center. The director, who also embodies the archetype of the king from a certain viewpoint, must manage the stars to make them act, while at the same time playing out for others, through the staging, their own understanding of the king. I want you to see the possible richness in the experience of all those who remain resonating on multiple planes of this archetype, thanks to Shakespeare. The Tree of Experience. Carutti. Shakespeare is the one who contacted or expressed that deep nucleus, thereby enabling all these new experiences for others. They may rekindle within themselves the desire for experience, or they may stimulate a profound understanding of it. Shakespeare is a tree in the sense that the vibration emerging from him branches out and intertwines with the vibrations of millions of other humans for centuries upon centuries. He represents an opportunity for countless human beings to experience that contact. Imagine this in Beethoven. Here we are dealing with a different kind of coordination. It is no longer a coordination between words, emotions, and human lived experiences. Rather, it is an organism that captures pure vibration. This is a degree of extreme abstraction. Yet at the same time, he is capable of capturing and coordinating it across the multiple instruments of the score. It is vital to register the quality that such an organism must possess. It must have an extraordinary capacity for subtle reception, coordinated with a capacity for manifestation that allows spectators, musicians, and directors to embody vibration and respond to it. The literary experience is one tree of experience, and the musical experience is another. The possibility of resonating with the abstract nature of music exists on a different octave than resonating with the word. Open the tree of Beethoven, plus that of Mozart, plus that of Wagner, and those of all the spectators, musicians, and directors. Can you draw it in your mind? It is this profound vibration arising from the center, and in the case of music, from beyond the center, which pours out and enters the fragmentary, drawing it back toward the heart of the whole. In this sense, cinema possesses this potential. It has the capacity to generate vibrations that detach us from our longings or, inversely, stimulate them and lead us toward repetition. Cinema can generate more violence or a weariness, a satiation of violence, depending on the capacity of the creators and the position of the spectators. I believe we can register the existence of historical kings with their concrete lived experiences and the existence of a Shakespeare who captures and synthesizes these types of experiences. These experiences are, moreover, symbols of the ego, and the permanence of that synthesis remains available for all who come after. What Shakespeare achieved is what esotericism calls a work of the soul. That is, the expression and creativity of that personality respond to a profound yearning to understand the totality of human experience and to make that same understanding possible for other human beings. Question: would that be another dimension? Carutti: it is another dimension within the torrent in which the torrent understands itself. This is a dimension of the torrent that reveals its own timelessness, but vibrationally, it is not outside of it. In other language, it is the wheel of incarnations decoding itself. It is not another dimension of the universe. It is the wheel learning to decode and reveal itself to be understood by all those turning upon it. It is the center of the wheel upon which the wheel turns. In these terms, which are always delicate, we can say that this personal center begins to respond to that deep center. In certain stages, there is a mere contact between them that may manifest as a flash, 1, 2, or 3 flashes throughout a lifetime. These are rebalancings of the fragmentary personal center, which then enters a more fluid and creative channel. It begins to respond faintly to the direction of understanding experiences rather than merely experiencing them. These contacts cause a reorientation. Contact with that deep level is always an influx of wisdom in terms of the personal center. There is synthesis and eventually inspiration, meaning wisdom, intuition, and inspiration within the human matrix, within the torrent. At another level, the personal center responds very concretely to this deep center. This is what is called soul work, in the sense that the activities to which this personal center is called deal explicitly with rebalancing the collective body of experiences for others. This can also include caring for dolphins. Do not think of it only in psychological, therapeutic, or loving terms, or through great teachings. Imagine that in the depths, this loving center unfolds into 7 veins that correspond to the 7 different vibrations we spoke of at the beginning. In each of these 7 different vibrations, the profound response arising from this level might be, for example, an understanding of the importance of the biosphere's balance, accompanied by repentance and pain for all human cruelty toward animals. This is being moved by that dimension. A person might then dedicate themselves to caring for dolphins. That is as much a work of the soul as psychic healing or teaching, because there, the yearning of the mind is not directed toward self-benefit, but toward discovering a cure for something fundamental to the human being or the earth. I say this because the most basic archetypal bias is to assume this is always something kind or loving in conventional terms. It can even be destructive. Question: can you give an example? Carutti, for instance, the inspiration of a political leader to destroy an ossified institutional system. Think of Gorbachev. It could be someone devoured by the yearning for experience, or an organism performing an act of a different order, opening a new range of possibilities for millions of human beings. In what we are calling soul work, there may or may not be conscious awareness of the fact that it originates from that dimension. Therefore, there is a third level, the awareness of the activity of this deep center within the daily life of that person. At this third level, the person is conscious of responding to the source of this wisdom or this dynamic. Clearly, as a symptom, beyond the specific work, this personality will be consciously interested in reabsorbing experience into their personal life. Within the torrent, this dynamic implies the possibility of a full identification with that deep center. When that contact occurs, there will be a human action of maximal wisdom, or that person will radiate some highly sublime human quality: beauty, clarity, lovingness, destruction, or a capacity for coordination. These various profound capacities are linked to that center and will manifest with great power. This is expressed through the personality, the center of the center and beyond. Carutti. From that point onward, another dynamic begins, one that lies at the very heart of this matter. It involves understanding how and why centers, both superficial and profound, are generated. It requires learning to undo the formation of the center, just as we must learn how and why we construct time, and how to dissolve the activity of thought that builds it. The image I want to propose to you is that the deep center, as wonderful and full of qualities as it may be, is still a center. In this dynamic, the personality center, previously formed through the drift of the torrent's experiences, begins to dissolve into the center that expresses and contains the matrix of human experience. This matrix holds within it the link to what lies beyond the human, yet it still appears in consciousness as a center. The next fundamental stage is for this center to dissolve as well. This is what you will find in some esoteric texts described as the death of the soul. The soul also dies in the sense that all activity functioning in favor of a center ceases, not just a psychological center, but a deep transpersonal one. This is the hardest thing for us to grasp because it is difficult for the soul to understand, let alone the personality. Something within human beings centralizes experience. For a process to open that goes beyond the center implies the eruption of forces that lie beyond the torrent, beyond the experience we decode as human. Question: it has to do with time. Carutti: it has to do with the center and the activity of creating time. This is the end of the soul's life, or the consummation of its activity. To prevent this from becoming too abstract, I believe there is a clue we can trace from the beginning. It involves understanding that the flower of humanity grows, and has its roots in the mud of humanity. It is the lotus with its roots in the mire. This points to a very useful clue in concrete psychological terms, realizing which quality in a person has nothing to do with their family of origin. That is what was born in the mud, in a pot of conditioning, but there is something there that does not belong to the pot. Psychologically, we could trace everything back to the family of origin, so it is highly relevant to learn to distinguish this. Usually, it will be present as destiny. In astrology, we call it destiny because that unknown pulse, which cannot be referenced to anything else, seeks to emerge through certain situations. What interests me is realizing that here is something that is in the origin but is not of the origin. This is a global structure. There is always something that does not belong to the context in which it appears. It is true, not of original time. It is unmanifested. On the next plane, we can say it is that which manifests in the person, but does not respond to the nation or the civilization in which they live. It is that which exists within a vehicle that is human, but is not a product of the human. When that which is not a product of the human emerges, then we are beyond this center. Practically all children are born with something that does not belong to their family or their environment. However, this is gradually covered by the pressure of the torrent, which generates the personality. This causes the child to learn to decode in a certain way, and eventually this wounds the child. When wounds are very deep, they trigger a thirst for compensatory experiences that make it almost impossible for the original element, the part that is not of the family, to surface because it remains trapped by the wounds and the longing for reparative experiences. Question: it has to do with the fact that everyone is unique. Carutti: I want to put it another way, because we all know that we are unique. It is not about saying, for example, Eugenio is not the son of his father and mother, but rather that there is something impersonal vibrating in that person, something there in potential that cannot be traced back to the family. Question: and it might not develop? Carutti: it might not develop. If the wounds are severe, they will provoke a longing for compensation, and this triggers a thirst for experience. This necessarily develops the personal center with all its strength and its pathologies, causing that potential to be buried. Eventually, this new thing will sprout, and it will be a surprise to the person. What I want to show you is this: something exists that is but does not belong. Taking this to the torrent, there is something in the torrent that does not belong to it. There is something in the human that does not belong to the human. It is a vibration, a quality that lies beyond. And here, returning to the beginning, we find the intuitive and inspirational levels and the capacity of this vehicle to not react to the torrent. The torrent does not sweep it away in its dynamics of experience because there is something in direct contact with that wisdom. Thus, eventually, that vehicle becomes a vehicle for another dimension. Question: it doesn't reflect the center. Carutti: I would say metaphorically that what you see is this universal center itself, but sufficiently open to bring through a vibration that complements the imbalances of the torrent. This is a work of the soul. One thing is the set of tasks that balance the torrent's deviations, allowing us all to move toward synthesis. Another thing entirely is the introduction of much more powerful principles that have the power to transform the torrent itself. Universal love is not in the torrent, it comes from the outside. The torrent sees it as an ideal, a form, an aspiration. It enters the torrent progressively through the fact that, for example, we no longer kill those who are different quite so quickly. Something has appeased our reactions, but universal love does not belong to the torrent. In other words, universal love does not arise from the sum of human lives. From the sum of human lives, one can gain an understanding of hatred, of pain, of false loves. But universal love comes from elsewhere. Of course, for that vibration to manifest in a personality structure, there must be an enormous capacity for resonance with partial loves. I am not devaluing anything. I am pointing out two different principles. Loving the beloved while wanting to kill the neighbor is not universal love. Nor is loving the beloved as long as they love me. Laughter. That is not a state of love. It is an induced love. I am trying to show different states of integration of the vehicle. There is a state where, from a physical standpoint, the brain accesses human memories. It accesses all human pain and beauty and learns to resonate with it. It learns to be in the experience of being open to what is not human, the human experience of being open to the non-human. As long as it is an experience of the center, we are still in a previous stage. But in the memory of the soul lies the memory of the state of openness, because that too is a human experience. It is there as a memory, a perfume, a potential. Question: this is what we saw regarding the difference between the fixed cross and the cardinal cross. It's about losing that center. Carutti: exactly. The cardinal cross is precisely this loss of center, because here we are dealing with a universal attitude where the personal holds no relevance. Question: the soul ceases to be a center. Carutti: what interests me is realizing how the process, the decoding of the vehicle, converts even the most sublime vibrations into a center. There comes a moment when that decoding dissolves, and this is fundamental. I would say that, as far as I can perceive, what is called the death of the soul is the dissolution of that decoding, in which a level of attachment to a certain way of understanding and processing reality still subsists. Question: in one of her books, Alice Bailey says that at this point Saturn disappears. Does it have to do with this? With the absence of time, the disappearance of the center? Carutti: that is what is implicit. I want to bring the focus of attention to all the dynamics of extreme beauty, subtlety, and creativity that are still organized around the center. For example, in Jungian psychology, which is a wonderful moment for much of this journey, it is still about the center. The possibility of a decentered self requires a personal psychic organization that lies beyond what Jung calls individuation and is linked to love. I say this to make it transparent, to avoid exaggerating the interpretation of the images or perceptions we produce regarding this level of deep wisdom. In dialogues, dreams, and images, where things appear as distinct segments. Initially, on this path of return, when the personal consciousness and the physical brain respond to this level of functioning, the image of a dialogue with an angelic someone appears, an inner angel, an inner figure of extreme wisdom. That is to say, it still appears in the form of a someone and references me. I don't say this to invalidate it, but to make it transparent. I would even say it's to register that these forms appear spontaneously. The issue is whether we give them excessive importance and fixate on them, or if we allow them to fulfill their function and disappear. Like any reaction, it appears spontaneously and need not be despised, denied, or repressed. The issue is the value we assign to that reaction, whether we can decode it as a reaction. The difficulty is that the no-center state is not desirable to the center because it does not trigger a known charge. Question: it's frightening. Carutti: it is frightening because it points to a void, and the charge it provokes is negative rather than positive. If we speak of the angel and its battle against the dweller on the threshold, at this level it generates a certain appetite. We can do that, but I think it's important that before we do, we touch upon this point. Question: it sounds very stark. Carutti: in one sense it seems like an anticlimax, but from another perspective, I believe this is the climax. This allows us to touch upon what we've discussed regarding spontaneous reactions and how objects are constituted for us. Every conversation, however esoteric, constructs objects or provokes vibrations. The key is how we decode them. The point is to touch this: how the psychological center finds it very difficult to handle the charge produced when it is forced to decode in terms of no center, precisely because there is no desire there. There is no desire for a no center, yet I want to show you that therein lies the beauty of it all. If there were a desire for a no center, it would still be the torrent. The desire to not reincarnate occurs in life number 4324. Laughter. But it is still within the matrix. Now we can stay with something that articulates itself as a goal and simultaneously an impossible goal, which disorganizes the whole system. Or we can stay with this while also embracing the entire web of the torrent's magical articulation, with all its experiences and its double drift, the drift toward the powerful personal center, and the drift toward a wisdom that synthesizes this entire experience. We need the necessity of understanding all that is human and vibrating all that is human, vibrating all the pain, the beauty, the love, the illusion, and the cruelty. We need to vibrate within that so the system learns not to react mechanically and can later learn not to react superficially to non-planetary vibrations or even those from beyond the solar system. That is within the dynamic. It is a profound necessity of the dynamic. Think about what a spiritual achievement means. It is a psychological phase of planet Earth. It doesn't matter when it occurs. It is a psychological phase. If I draw it from a voracious center, then it is an achievement. It is framed as an achievement. What is necessary is to see this and touch upon the fact that this is the potential. Question: can it be lived as a state? Carutti: I think the best way to configure this is by realizing that the ego is a state and the soul is also a state. They are states of being that respond to global articulations of integration across the entire system. They are not entities. The ego is not something. It is a way of registering and decoding. Question: could you speak a bit more about the need to undo the activity of thought? Laughter. Carutti: the important thing is to realize that we construct time. The mental process organizes itself by proposing achievements, saying, for example, today I didn't understand what Eugenio said, but when I read the notes, I will understand it. Laughter. This is a description of the mental process. The mental process has that activity of which we are not conscious. But if we observe that activity closely, we will see that it has the capacity to generate desire, to generate fear, to contract us, or to expand us. In reality, the word undo is incorrect, because there is no someone who can undo it.